Great. Welcome. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everybody. My name is Lucy Stackpole-Moore, and I'm the Director of HIV Programs and Advocacy with the International AIDS Society. Welcome to this session. It's a very exciting session for us, and it's called Getting to the Heart of Stigma. What does it take to have an impact at scale? And we're thrilled today to be joined by a fantastic panel to help the IAS launch a new initiative we have that's really around consolidating the global evidence base and contextualizing that evidence base in 4 African countries, in South Africa, Kenya, Malawi, and Zambia. And so without further ado, I'd like to really thank our panelists for joining us today. It's an inspirational and very experienced group of people, and we're really honored that they're sharing their perspectives and time with us today. In terms of who's on that panel, we have Professor Adiba Camaralzaman, President of the International AIDS Society and the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Malaya, Malaysia. We have Justice Edwin Cameron, a retired Justice of the Constitutional Court in South Africa. We have Dr. Laura Ferguson, a Director of Research at the University of Southern California Institute on Inequalities and Global Health. We also have Kate Thompson, the Head of Community Rights and the Gender Department at the Global Fund here in Geneva, Switzerland. And we also have 2 fantastic representatives from Zambia. Firstly, the Right Honourable Given Katucha, who's a Member of Parliament in Zambia and a member of the Unite Global Parliamentarians Network. She's just currently having some challenges connecting, so hopefully we'll be able to welcome her soon to the session. And last and certainly not least, we have Thomas Muchimba Butenskon, I hope I've pronounced that correctly. He's a musician and HIV activist who originates from Zambia and is now living in Denmark as well. So what a fantastic panel, and thank you all so much for joining us today. In terms of the session, each of the panelists is going to speak to 2 questions. The first one is, what does it mean to get to the heart of stigma for them personally? And the second question is, what will it take to get to the heart of stigma at scale? And so what I'll do is in between each one, introduce the following speaker. And at the end, we do have an opportunity for a few question and answers. But I would also encourage everybody listening to please join the conversation on social media and add your response to those 2 questions using the hashtag Heart of Stigma. So thanks for joining us today. We're going to start with the IAS President, Professor Adiba Camaralzaman, who essentially would like to be introduced as an HIV physician and long-term activist and advocate in these issues. Adiba, thanks for joining us today. Over to you. What does it take to get to the heart of stigma at scale, and what does getting to the heart of stigma mean to you?
Hi, Lucy. Hi, everyone. I'll take the first question. I'll take the first question first, which is, what does getting to the heart of stigma mean to me? I think, as we heard from the film, the speakers before this, getting to the heart of stigma means getting to the heart of lack of knowledge and the fear. I think, nearly 4 decades of the HIV, there are still a lot of people who, because of the lack of knowledge around HIV and the inherent fear that they have, develop the stigma to others who are living with HIV. So getting to the heart of that means educating people about what HIV is, how it's transmitted, really, really basic things you would think that we wouldn't have to do in 2020, but unfortunately we just have to keep educating. And in terms of how do we take it to scale, well, I'm an educationist, and I think one of the largest groups that unfortunately still perpetuate stigmatization are the healthcare workers. And Lucy, we have the Me and My Healthcare Worker program. I think it needs to start with healthcare workers. So as an educationist, I'm very keen to see programs institutionalized in medical schools, nursing schools, because stigma doesn't just stop with HIV, there's stigma to mental health, etc. So we need to do that. And secondly, of course, the other big source of stigmatization are the criminalization of HIV itself, of people who use drugs, of MSM, in sex workers, transgenders, key populations in general. all over the world. And we've got, Justice Edwin Cameron here, who knows better than I do, but I think that is one of the root causes of stigma the world over. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Adiba. We'll come back to you with some questions and follow up in due course, but I'm delighted now to see Edwin and welcome him again to the panel. Justice Edwin Cameron is a retired Constitutional Court judge. I'm sure he doesn't need much introduction, but he retired just last year after 25 years serving as a judge in South Africa, and is now still keeping busy inspecting as an inspecting judge of prisoners and Chancellor of Stellenbosch University, and remains an activist in LGBTI and AIDS issues. Edwin, thanks for joining us today. Over to you. Hang on, Edwin, we can't quite hear you still from the mic.
Okay.
There we go, that's perfect, yep. Perfect.
Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm very pleased to meet Professor Adiba, and many of you are old comrades, particularly Kate. Kate and I go a long way back as comrades living with HIV and fighting the battle for physical survival, and more important, as this session shows, Lucy, and it's a very important session, also fighting the battle for mental survival, which is what stigma is about. I do agree with what Professor Adiba has said. Stigma's hurt and sting lie in the brand that it burns into the forehead of the other. Racial, cultural, gender, orientational, disability, religion, age. It is a brand of rejection and denunciation of the other as inferior. It is ostracism and rejection. What is distinctive about stigma in AIDS is the moralistic condemnation that it entails. We are all scared of contagion, rightly and rationally so. Yet AIDS, HIV, is not contagious. HIV is an infectious agent that is transmitted with much difficulty through extremely limited pathways, principally, and in about 95% of cases, through sexual intercourse. And here is the key. It is in this sex, sexual intercourse, sexual congress, the connubium between two human bodies, that the reason for the special stigma of rejection and condemnation lie in the case of AIDS. Sexual moralism condemns others for having sex in a way and with another that they consider inappropriate, immoral, unethical, or unbiblical. In many cases, it condemns them simply for having sex, even with consenting adults in private, with another consenting adult in private. There are many forms of contagion that do not evoke sexual moralism. Most conspicuous of these is right now COVID-19. Though there is COVID blaming and there is also COVID stigma, it is not combined with vindictive accusatory sexual moralism. It is therefore infinitely less harmful, infinitely less potent. In AIDS, the particular potency of sexual moralism is magnified because without treatment, AIDS is almost invariably fatal. Kate, why are you here this afternoon? You're still living. I'm so pleased. And I'm pleased that I'm living too, 21 years after starting ARVs, long before most of my fellow Africans on this continent. And I'm very pleased to say, this is just a quick insert, that almost 5 million South Africans are now living because of antiretroviral treatment. And I'll come back to a paradox about that, because even though we have the world's largest national concentration of people living with HIV, almost 8 million, and 5 million of them on successful ARV treatment, it hasn't brought the level of stigma down entirely. So there we know that AIDS is fatal, but it can be treated. Getting to the heart of stigma in AIDS, therefore, means, in my mind, confronting the sexual moralism that lies at the heart of stigma. And it is the very same vindictive sexual moralism that ostracizes and criminalizes transgender people, lesbians, homosexual men. I experienced that moralism first as a gay man who proudly came out just before my 30th birthday. Then I experienced it as someone who, as a gay man, had acquired HIV. And I experienced the double shame of thinking that I'd acquired HIV in a way that people would condemn me for. And that's what I blamed myself for, until I realized when I started working with Black heterosexual women that this wasn't the cause at all. It was sexual moralism, not distinctively anti-gay sexual moralism. Because those Black women that I worked with in my legal practice, who were the spouses of Black mine workers in South Africa, experienced the same blame and the same sense of shame about being infected with HIV. In all cases, including AIDS, the terrible punitive power of the criminal law has been used to inflict wretchedness and misery on too many people. Yet the most significant feature of AIDS stigma remains the least understood. It is the internalization of stigma about HIV and AIDS by the person with HIV or AIDS or at risk of it. Internalization of stigma is a well-known but poorly understood phenomenon. In the 19th century, the self-hating Jew, amongst LGBTIQ people, self-hating queers, and indeed amongst all race groups that have been subjected historically to systematized subordination, degradation, humiliation, and stigma, there's often an element of internalization of the oppressor's hatefulness. In HIV, internalized stigma is unprecedentedly powerful. It continues to make this an epidemic of 30 million people on my continent still an epidemic of muteness, an epidemic of unspokenness, an epidemic of silence. Despite the fact that tens of millions of people across the world are living with HIV, particularly in Central and Southern Africa, despite the fact that HIV is now relatively easily medically manageable, the number of people who identify themselves as living with HIV and AIDS remains astonishingly small. This is particularly so in the elite sectors of Central and Southern African society. Our MPs, our presidents, our cabinet ministers, our singers, our soccer players, we know that 11% of South Africa, 13%, are living with HIV and AIDS. So we know that 13% of soccer players, 13% of members of parliament have got it, but they don't speak about it. Almost none of them have spoken about it. The primary cause is not externalized, enacted stigma. That's discrimination. You deal with that with the law. You deal with that with fight back. It's much more insidious. It's internalization. Well, what will it take to get to the heart of stigma at scale? I think we need a two-pronged strategy. The first prong is to confront the enactment of stigma, its externalized form in workplace discrimination, gender-based violence, 16 days of activism against gender-based violence in South Africa right now, housing discrimination, sexual exclusion, or social exclusion. And of course, because women are more frequently identified as living with HIV because they go to antenatal or postnatal clinics, they bear the burden of hatred and condemnation that their male partners who gave them the HIV heap upon them because they don't accept responsibility. But the second prong, and this is where I end, is far more difficult to address. It has to be directed to this internalized aspect of stigma. And here I think three things are needed. First, we must recognize that internalized stigma is keeping people silent and ashamed. Secondly, we have to have a campaign of unmuteness, a campaign of speaking out, a campaign of liberatory talk about HIV. And I want to emphasize something here. I've never in my whole life, not for 35 years of living with HIV, have I ever asked another person to speak about their own HIV. It's too difficult a decision. It's too private. It's too intimate a decision. I never will ask a public personality or a leader or a soccer player or a singing star to come out about their own HIV. They have to make that decision themselves, and they're entitled to remain silent. What I will say is how much good it will do if we had soccer stars and singers and leaders and presidents who say, not my son who's died, but me, I'm living with HIV. I'm only saying how much good that will do. So first, recognizing the problem. Secondly, unmuting. And thirdly, the slow process of encouraging those who have muted themselves because of their inner shame about having HIV or AIDS to disburden themselves, to unshackle themselves, to free themselves, to come to see, perhaps even talk about their HIV infection as simply an ordinary, manageable chronic condition. And all of this without blaming the victim. In other words, without conceptualizing internal stigma as being the responsibility of the person who suffers from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Edwin. Some very powerful words in there, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of these at the end, particularly around your points around moralism and then the internalization of stigma and what it can take to overcome for oneself, but also help.
Lucy, can I just quickly say it's the same sexual moralism that terrorizes and condemns and ostracizes sex workers.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think actually one of the questions, I won't ask it now, but maybe I'll ask it and you can speak to it later, but is how stigma, it can be attached to something different, right? But that feeling is almost universally the same about feeling belittled or ashamed or smaller than oneself. And that'd be an interesting thing to think about for the panel. I did have one other point, but I'm going to hold it off for the next one. So we don't run short of time. Thank you so much, Edwin, for being here today. Our next speaker is Kate Thompson. Kate, thank you for joining us today. And Kate has been working on issues of HIV and stigma since the 1980s in community-based peer-led HIV organizations and within multilateral institutions, including the Global Fund and UNAIDS. Kate, thanks so much for your perspective, and I know you have a lot of insights on this as well. From your side, what do you think it will take to get to the heart of stigma and its scale?
Thanks, Lucy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So it's always a privilege to speak after or be on the same platform as Edwin in particular, but it's also a bit daunting. So, but Edwin, thank you for reminding us of one of the slogans that we basically used to always talk about and show at the beginning of the epidemic, which is silence equals death. And I think that really resonated for me with what you said. And I think we all know stigma is pervasive in all settings, and it operates on a personal and interpersonal, organizational and structural levels. But at the end of the day, as you said, Edwin, the effect on the individual who's being stigmatized can be devastating. I've seen it happen to many people I love. I've had it myself. And we often talk about the need for HIV responses to be person-centered in order to be effective. And therefore, if we don't get to the roots or to the heart of stigma and understand its complexities and then work to address them, we're never going to achieve truly effective responses to HIV. I'm going to speak somewhat within the context of being a donor these days rather than just my own personal experiences of HIV. But so I think within the limited resources available, one of the issues and the problems we see is that country programs on stigma are often looking for that silver bullet, which is a bit like the same silver bullet they look to for prevention of HIV, the biomedical approach, just do PrEP or just do test and treat. So this approach to stigma has resulted often in sporadic one-off stigma interventions that don't get sustained over time. And we know this doesn't work, because stigma does require that comprehensive and multi-pronged responses. So to get to the heart of stigma, we first of all need to know our stigma epidemics. We need to understand what's happening, how they're manifesting in different settings and contexts, and at all those different levels. And importantly, what Edwin's spoken to, their intersectionalities. Because unfortunately, a lot of stigma reduction efforts don't focus on that intersectionality of stigma as it relates to marginalized social positions and identities, for instance, race, ethnicity, sexual and gender identity, and importantly, criminalization. So not taking into account those varied manifestations of stigma makes programs less effective. And in addition, we're not doing enough to really act on the immediate legal obligation of non-discrimination on any grounds, and to demand accountability for actions that are the result of stigma. And so efforts to regularly generate evidence around stigma are also quite poor and insufficient in their scope and their depth. And importantly, a lack of resources to support affected communities of people living with HIV, of key populations, of others who are heavily impacted, to support them to generate evidence, means that studies such as the Stigma Index can't be done systematically and regularly and at scale. So for me, getting to the heart of stigma is also then, once we've generated the relevant evidence and properly understood the breadth and the depth and the diversities of our stigma epidemics, we should then be using those learnings and insights to inform comprehensive programmatic efforts across multiple settings and levels, undertaken by multiple partners, with communities always at the centre and in the lead. And these tailored and properly resourced interventions to reduce stigma and other human rights related barriers need to be integrated across all the different levels of the HIV cascade to be truly effective. For the Global Fund, where I work now, to get to the heart of stigma, we're working through we have a flagship project called Breaking Down Barriers, where we're aiming to dramatically reduce human rights related barriers by scaling up programs that will address them. This effort over the last few years, the last funding cycle of 3 years, has led to a 7-fold increase in investments in human rights in 20 countries. And we've overall invested around 123 million in programs to reduce these barriers. And we estimate that at least a third of this 123 million was geared towards addressing stigma and discrimination. So we're really trying to scale up those efforts. So what is it going to take to get to the heart of stigma at scale? Well, we have recognition now, I think, that stigma and other human rights related barriers interfere with effective epidemic responses. We know that now, we have the evidence. But what we really need to see across the board is much more comprehensive responses, which need to be planned for, to be funded, to be implemented. We need to see these programs implemented at scale to really have positive and sustainable impact on stigma. And that involves deliberate and planned efforts to increase the quality, quantity, reach, sustainability and impact of activities to address stigma, starting with clear, comprehensive plans that have buy-in of all stakeholders. That's the foundation for success, I think. Ensuring that these plans have measurable results and indicators to track progress and are fully costed is also critical. We really need to see that efforts to reduce stigma and discrimination are recognised not as nice to have, but as key pillars of disease programmes, and that clear national targets where possible are set, and accountable bodies. Accountability is important. Accountable bodies overseeing and leading the work across stakeholders and sectors, and really continuing to fund comprehensive interventions to know what the human rights related barriers are to access, including stigma. Critically, we must continue to champion and resource community leadership in these efforts, recognising that stigmatised communities are equal partners with valuable perspectives and skills and expertise to bring to the table. We all need to be putting our money where our mouth is. We're trying to do that at the Global Fund to resource comprehensive programmatic responses, as well as documenting what works, so we can generate more evidence of impact, which then hopefully leads to more investments. Lastly, just in closing, I wanted to say that changing attitudes can happen. I've seen it happen. When I was growing up, my parents had a number of gay friends who were unable to be open in their families or in their work environments. And yet nowadays, some of these friends are actually in same-sex marriages. It's changed in the course of like 40, 50 years or even less. in the UK where I come from. And information is power. The more that we know and understand about stigma and what we're up against, then the easier it is to fight it and to know what strategies we need to employ to do that. Stigma is insidious and it's deeply damaging, as Edwin said to individuals and to communities and to our societies, but it can be overcome. And I know, thank you for organising this session, because I know all of us here are committed to really playing our part to get to the heart of stigma and make that happen. Over.
And fantastic. Thank you so much, Kate. Fantastic remarks, as always. And I think if I could just pull out one thing you said towards the end there around the accountability and communities and people experiencing stigma as partners in all of this, and to connect that a bit with the evidence base, there are some fantastic initiatives. And you mentioned the Stigma Index that's been going for a number of years now, that is peer-driven, peer-led, and really robustly trying to document the lived experiences of stigma to better complement the other areas of research and science underway there. So it is actually about galvanizing and strengthening the evidence base to best inform how we can respond in an effective way. And I think you also mentioned this notion of a comprehensive response to get to scale. And in some ways, that's a little glimmer of insight about the composition of this panel, actually, because if you look at this, we have some academics from different backgrounds and different ways engaged in the global conversation. We have global health funding with the Global Fund representation here, and we have the justice sector, the structural laws and policies dimension, and then the arts and culture section with Thomas and his musical experience. So in a small way, and how we're going to go about implementing this body of work with the IAS, we're actually trying to use this as a way of bringing together multiple perspectives and expertise and actors who can be profoundly influential in doing something to address stigma at scale. So that's an insight into the method behind the madness of this session. Now, I think I'd like to hand over now to Laura Ferguson. As I mentioned, she's the Director of Research at the University of Southern California, the Institute on Inequalities in Global Health. And Laura's research focuses on understanding and addressing health system and societal factors affecting health and the uptake of health services, as well as developing an evidence base on how attention to human rights can help improve health outcomes. Thanks for joining us today, Laura. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Lucy, and it's such a pleasure to be here as part of this panel. And I think it's a really exciting group of people that you have brought together. So I think, for me, getting to the heart of stigma, it means getting to the heart of human emotion and human behaviors. We're talking about disentangling and tackling some really difficult issues such as fear, shame, prejudice, and the sexual moralism that Edwin spoke about. And we have to address the ways that these are manifest at all different levels, from the personal to the structural. So it does mean understanding self-stigma, again, recognizing that we don't understand it sufficiently to date. We know it's rooted in fear and in shame. It means understanding stigma enacted by others stemming from prejudice and also from fear. And the thing is that these fears, the shame, the prejudice, like all of this leads to harmful behaviors. Stigma manifests in discrimination. Discrimination manifests in human rights violations. And so getting to the heart of stigma means putting an end to all of this. And, Kate mentioned this. We've been talking about stigma since the very beginning of the epidemic, and we still haven't really figured out what to do, right? And so what do we need? Well, I'm one of the researchers on the panel, so I think we need to start by taking stock of what we know and what we don't know. And you just rightly pointed out, there are some very good examples out there of programs that work and of processes that are effective. And we need to have those documented. But we have a very fragmented evidence base around, first of all, how different types of stigma affect different populations and in different places. Second, around the measurement of some of this, and the Stigma Index is a very good example, but it's just one. And third, we don't know enough about the effectiveness of the different interventions that exist to try to mitigate against the negative impacts of stigma. So we have to better understand where there's been success at tackling stigma to date and where we've fallen short. And in both of these, we have to understand why, right? And that means research on laws and policies, on health behaviors, on human psychology, on so much more. And of course, on how it all fits together and how it plays out in different places, and ultimately what this means for trying to affect change, right? Research is just a starting point. There has to be research to inform action, and then we have to know that the action itself is grounded in evidence, right? So how you take this to scale, I think, is like the $1 million question, right? But once we figure out what we know and what we don't know, I think the next step is that we need everyone on board. And again, that's why I really appreciate the composition of the panel. I think the research community will be critical in helping to fill knowledge gaps and to keep generating new knowledge as this work evolves. Law and policy makers obviously have key roles in creating conducive legal and policy environments that protect against stigma and discrimination. Program implementers, we will have to design, implement, monitor the interventions that we know can work. We've spoken already about educators and health workers and the key roles that they play. And funders have to commit to this. Kate, I so appreciated your comments. We know that implementing contextualized interventions at scale is a massive challenge, especially when we're talking about changing personal and societal beliefs and behaviors. So it's going to take money, and it's not a quick fix. And I think for all of us, we have to recognize that these have to be long-term commitments. And of course, at every step of the way, this has been said, community have to be at the heart of this. Solid, equitable partnerships have to be the foundation of what we're talking about, whether it's laws, policies, interventions, or research. And just to reiterate, that's not business as usual. We talk a lot about meaningful involvement of communities, but we still don't actually do enough of it. And I do want to flag, I think human rights can help with all of this. I think that, first of all, situating communities as rights holders can be very empowering. And on the other side, I think that rights provide this framework for helping governments to prevent the types of human rights violations that can result from stigma and discrimination. And similarly, and this has already been mentioned, the framework can also be used for holding governments to account if they don't prevent these violations. And I do think that issue of accountability is really important. So it's an incredibly useful framework for all the broader action that has to happen. But ultimately, we have to find the role that everyone can play. We have to leverage all of our collective strengths across disciplines, across sectors, across geographies, across really any other difference you can possibly imagine. And working together, that's how we're going to get to the heart of stigma at scale. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Laura. Working together, I think, is absolutely critical. Thank you. I see now we have, I hope, the Right Honourable Given Katuta, who's been able to connect finally. Can I just check? Welcome, Given. Are you able to hear us? We can see you. We can't yet hear you, but welcome to the
Yes,
session.
I can.
There we go.
I can. Sorry,
so much.
I had challenges.
Well done for persevering, and thanks for joining us. We only have, I think, 5 minutes left now, but I would really like to hear from yourself and also from Thomas. And so if I could just ask you, even just to speak to the first question, just in 1 to 2 minutes, what does getting to the heart of stigma mean to you from the perspective of as being a political leader within the context of Zambia? Over to you, Given. Just a short response, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me though?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Can you hear me? You can. Sorry, I must apologize for struggling with my gadgets. Actually, I'll quickly speak to what stigma has been doing to people in Zambia. And
oh, shame. I think we had what a tease that is. Anyway, I think it's probably unlikely the Right Honourable Member of Parliament is going to be able to reconnect. So I'd just like to thank her for her time, and I hope we might be able to record her remarks and share them through social media and other things after this session. But so Thomas, you've been patiently with us the whole time, and thank you very much for joining us today. We would like to close with your song as well, so we'll have that bit of you as well. But if I can now come to you, and as a musician and an HIV activist, and your experience in Denmark and also as a child in Zambia. From your perspective, what does it take to get to the heart of stigma at scale, and what does it mean to you personally?
To me personally, you know, the whole thing, if you want to talk about stigma, is just so difficult because it starts with yourself, which means that everybody, as you even can see in the movie, everybody's experiencing different types of stigma. You know, there was a girl saying she didn't feel stigma at all, and there was a guy saying that he felt a lot of stigma. And for me, I can only speak for myself when I'm saying this. I don't feel the stigma, and I never did, because I was told when I was a kid growing up, you know, this was not your fault. This was just something, you were in bad luck. And where we are right now, you know, I can always tell people that, you know, I'm not dangerous. So you don't run a risk of getting close with me. I mean, of course, I run a risk in every relationship I'm in, but I know that HIV is not part of that. I mean, it could be because I play too much music and I like to sleep late and stuff like that. But seriously, I mean, HIV is not going to be part of my problem, because it's not. I'm taking some pills and that's it. And I have my two sons, you know, one of them, he's turning 10 in May, you know, and he's not infected. My youngest, he's turning 7 in June. He's not infected, you know, and I made them the natural way that you make babies. And it's because of the medicine. It's because that if you're well treated, you're unable to pass this on. So every time if I'm meeting somebody who's scared of me because of me being HIV positive, I know it's because I have failed to tell them how stuff works. And it's simple as that, as I see it. But then again, you know, it depends on how you feel it yourself. Because I have friends that, you know, they're scared. They're so scared to tell their status to anyone, you know. And you know, I can't come out to them and be like, come on, wake up, tell your story. But because it's such a personal thing to feel the way that you feel. What I've experienced is that I know that I want to use the talent I was given to write songs and to tell my story combined with my music. Because if I want to take this to scale, then I want to save some lives. And globally, there's still so many people dying every single year because of this disease. And because people there are scared to get tested, because they're scared of being like not picked for the team, you know. And it's just, to me, it's bollocks, you know. I'm like, come on, wake up, world, please. People shouldn't die of this, you know. They should just take the medicine, don't infect others, love the people that you love, you know. Simple as that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Thomas. And I can unashamedly do a plug for your film that I believe just launched for World AIDS Day this year. It's called Doing My Drugs. Yes. It's a fantastic documentary about an initiative Thomas led in Zambia and globally to encourage testing. And that is the title track that we'll finish with today. But just before we close, I would encourage everyone to continue the conversation on social media. Hashtag Heart of Stigma. Please do add your perspectives on this or engage with some of the questions that we didn't have a time to get to today. And I actually thought I was chuckling away when Edwin talked about an unmuteness campaign. And I think in this age of Zoom and digital technology, that has a whole new resonance actually this year. But I think really around visibility and courage and stepping out of the shadow is all part of this. And very specifically just about the project that we've all collectively joined to launch today through this session. It is focusing on 3 angles that have been critical to the discussion today. One is around the evidence base and effective action to address internalized stigma. One is around mitigating the effects and reducing stigma experienced in healthcare settings. And then the third level is looking at structures, laws and policies that can either enable the reduction of stigma or can continue to pose such a harmful and destructive barrier. So please stay tuned for further updates from this project. And we'd like to close with the video with Thomas's song. And just lastly, final word from me is thank you immensely to this fantastic panel. We've been really honored to have you today. And thank you for sharing your insights. Everyone have a wonderful weekend and help join together to get to the heart of stigma. Thanks so much.
Looking out my window, there's nothing there to see. Gray tone of atmosphere and European dreams, and I'm waiting by the phone for you to call and tell me whether I'm up or down, 'cause nothing is over till it hits the ground. I'm doing my drugs 'cause I don't want to hurt you at all. I'm doing my drugs 'cause I don't want to hurt you at all. I'm doing my drugs 'cause I don't want to hurt you at all. I'm doing my drugs. I'm doing my drugs, yeah. kids are in the garden, and I can tell you're happy 'cause your smile is so immortal. Like the day we fell in love. If all of this is postures, I'd love to work with you until we're done, 'cause nothing is perfect like a home run. I'm doing my drugs 'cause I don't want to hurt you at all. I'm doing my drugs 'cause I don't want to hurt you at all. I'm doing my drugs 'cause I don't want to hurt you at all. I'm doing my drugs. I'm doing my drugs, yeah. And I could have been the circles and the paper and the pen, and you could have been the perfect and the paper and the pen, and we could have been the surface and the paper and the pen. Oh, I'm doing my drugs 'cause I don't want to hurt you at all. I'm doing my drugs 'cause I don't want to hurt you at all. I'm doing my drugs 'cause I don't want to hurt you at all. I'm doing my drugs. I'm doing my drugs, yeah. I'm doing my drugs 'cause I don't want to hurt you at all. I'm doing my drugs 'cause I don't want to hurt you at all. I'm doing my drugs 'cause I don't want to hurt you at all. No, no, I don't want to hurt you at all. I don't want to hurt you at all. No, I don't want to hurt you at all.